I've seen emails from schools which have said, if you wish to have an exemption to wearing a mask in this year, you will now have to prove that you have a medical exemption. And if you can't prove that, then you may be excluded from school. I mean, that first of all appears to me to be an outstretch of the law, because you can't do that. You can't ask anybody else for an exemption in a shop or on public transport. But so how can schools do it? And secondly, this business of saying if you will only now be fully vaccinated, in their words, if you have had 3 jabs rather than 2. You know, what's the legal position on all of this stuff?
In relation to schools, the guidance about mask wearing for children is only guidance. That's the first point. So there's no legal requirement. Any school head teacher could say, no, I'm not going to follow this guidance because it's wrong. Indeed, from a legal perspective, every school has an obligation as both an employer and an employer who has other persons on the premises, which includes children, that's the legal definition, an obligation to undertake risk assessments. I've seen some risk assessments by schools. They do not consider the risk to children from this disease and this infection, and they do not consider the harms that might be caused to those children by masks. Now, it may or may not be that those balance each other out, although I doubt it, because the risk to children from this infection is minimal. It's lower probably than the common cold, certainly much lower than flu, especially now with this very low impact but high transmissible Omicron variant. And the only risk that should be considered when it comes to children, particularly when it comes to children, is them. This is not acceptable from a legal perspective to protect teachers. It's certainly not acceptable to protect other members of the public. So from a legal perspective, most schools appear not to be following the law by not doing adequate risk assessments that consider the harm, both psychological and physical, to children from masks. They haven't done the studies. The government hasn't done the studies in that. So the government's advice doesn't do the trick for those schools. The second legal point of view, the second legal point is that these are an intervention for children that require parental consent. So parents, not only if a child has an exemption, is a parent entitled to refuse, but in any circumstance. So a parent can and should say to the school, if they don't wish their child to wear a mask, that they are not going to permit them to do that, and the school has an obligation to follow it.
No. So the school can't exclude a child on the basis that they haven't provided medical evidence of an exemption?
No, they can't.
And so if you're a parent and they try to do that nonetheless, what's your next option?
Well, I mean, then the next option is to challenge the school in the way that parents can challenge with boards. But it's obviously there are difficulties, practical difficulties for a parent if that happens. But the important point is that schools should be following the law, which is to do the risk assessments, to respect parental choice, and to not require parents to inform the school of private medical information about their child that is not required by them. As you say, it wouldn't be required. It wouldn't be permissible for an employer to do this to a shop worker. No. It wouldn't be permissible for a shop to require this of a customer coming into their shops, because they have to accept, if a person says they're exempt, that they are exempt.
I mean, I've always wondered about that, because I thought, if you are, say, for example, a shop owner, I presume you have the right, if you wish, to stop someone from entering your premises on the grounds that you don't like to look at them. I mean, I know there's various discriminatory sort of rules that will come into effect there. But are you, as a shop owner, able to actually say, I don't want you in my shop?
Well, the reason for an exemption is likely to be that a person has a disability. So if you are a keeper, and you say to a customer, I don't believe you, what's your exemption? You're requiring that person to give information about their private medical details, which would obviously be a breach of their privacy, and would also be indirectly discriminatory if they were disabled. That's right. And that shop owner cannot know by looking at somebody whether or not they're disabled. Right. And that might include, for example, PTSD. Right. Any number of different conditions that might include. So that's why that would be at least an indirect discriminatory act.
Right. And so while you could, for example, exclude someone who had previously shoplifted from your store, because that's presumably a reasonable reason to keep somebody out, you couldn't do it on the basis that somebody's not wearing a mask.
No.
Okay. Let's look at the next part of what's happening in our schools. Segregation, apparently, is going on. Walton High, an academy in Buckinghamshire, has said that any pupils who are exempt from wearing face masks will be seated at the back of classrooms at the furthest point from the teachers, and also people who refuse to take tests will similarly be sat as far away as possible. So they're effectively creating two sets of school children.
And given that the school accepts, at least impliedly, those children are exempt, they're likely to have some form of disability for being exempt.
Yes.
It is therefore directly, not indirectly, discriminating against them.
Right.
So, also creating, it's also breaching their fundamental right to be educated as children within the confines of the school. And it's almost certainly doing so, or certainly if it is like any of the other schools that I've seen in this case, doing so without having adequately or at all risk assessed masks. And risk assessment that says, there is a terrible spread of COVID and we must do something, and the government says we must do masks, is not in any way a sufficient risk assessment, because it doesn't consider the risk to the child from the infection, or the ability of the mask to mitigate that risk, or the harm that might cause that child psychologically and physically of a mask.
Okay.
Being restricted in breathing for 6 to 10 hours a day. To say that has no effect without any medical evidence, which many people do, is risible, frankly. Right. And to say it has no psychological and sociological effect is also risible. In fact, I acted in a case in which we had two experts, one dealing with the potential physical effects of masks, considering the evidence, and the other considering the potential psychiatrist specialist in children's mental health, considering the potential sociological and psychological effects on children, because masks are a barrier to communication, they're a barrier to ordinary interaction in ordinary life.
Absolutely right. And how about this, right? This is a direct quote from an email sent from a school in Bedfordshire. If they have a reason to be exempt from wearing a face covering, exemption lanyards can be obtained from student services following the provision of evidence. Exemption lanyards must be worn at all times. Students who refuse to wear a face covering or a lanyard will in fact be prevented from attending school. That's a quote.
Well, the first point to make is, why do they need to wear a lanyard if they're not wearing a mask, and it can be assumed that they are therefore exempt, or their parent doesn't give permission for them to wear a mask? There's no need to mark them out. But the second point is that is a deliberate provocation of other pupils to bully children.
Yeah.
And that's what many schools are doing. And I've also seen many reports of teachers who are bullying children, and teachers who are providing propaganda, essentially, by the government, ill-informed, deeply ill-informed, as many teachers unfortunately are about that subject, without any sort of context, and in such a way as is done deliberately to encourage other children to bully children who do not comply with that propaganda. And that's being done constantly around the country by teachers. And I've seen many examples of that. We can only need to look at the unions and their extraordinary influence over government policy and the extraordinarily fanatical belief that they have, totally unevidenced, in the ability of masks to prevent transmission of an aerosol transmitted infection, totally unevidenced and stupidly, frankly. We only need to see their influence to see how pernicious it is.
Absolutely, because if you look into the private sector, a lot of private schools are not operating in any way in the same manner and with the same kinds of regulations. I've got a question here from Paul, Francis, if you don't mind addressing it. He says, I work for a supermarket chain and we've been told to wear a mask and they class them as part of the uniform. Where do we stand with that?
It can't be classed as part of the uniform. As I said, the employer has an obligation to its employees to respect both their privacy and their potential disability. And if an employee says to their employer that they are not required to wear a mask under the regulations, then they are not required to wear a mask under the regulations. And it isn't for the employer to investigate whether or not they are. Now, I appreciate that the legal framework is that the exemptions are limited and they are set out, but they are also wide, and they don't require, for example, an illness. That they require that a person may suffer distress, and they may suffer distress from wearing a mask for any number of reasons. It's not for the employer to pry into those, and it's not for the employer to be able to investigate whether or not that person is telling the truth.
Right.
The employer shouldn't do that.